Have you ever felt like your dreams were impossible because you didn't have the right background, the right education, or the right connections? Let me tell you the story of a young woman who had none of those things. No university degree, no scientific training, no money. But she had something far more powerful, an unshakable dream and the courage to pursue it. She was just a secretary with a love for animals when she stepped off a boat onto the shores of Africa. But through her patience, her revolutionary observations, and her deep respect for nature, she became one of the most important scientists of our time. This woman is Jane Goodall, a name that has become synonymous with compassion, groundbreaking research, and hope for our planet. Her story is not just about studying chimpanzees, it's about defying expectations, challenging the scientific establishment, and proving that empathy can be just as important as expertise. It's about a lifelong commitment to making the world better for all living things. Today, we'll journey through her remarkable life, from a curious child in England to the forests of Tanzania, from an untrained observer to a world-renowned scientist, from studying chimps to becoming a global ambassador for conservation. By the time you finish this story, you'll not only know Jane Goodall's incredible journey, but you'll also feel inspired to follow your own passions, no matter how impossible they may seem. And remember, as we go along, keep learning new English words and phrases, just like Jane believed in constantly learning from the natural world around her. A dream born from a toy chimpanzee. Valerie Jane Morris Goodall was born on April 3, 1934, in London, England, during a time when the world was very different. World War II was just around the corner, opportunities for women were limited, and the idea of a woman traveling alone to Africa to study animals was practically unheard of. Jane's family was not wealthy. Her father, Mortimer Herbert Morris Goodall, was a businessman and race car driver. Her mother, Margaret My Fondly Joseph, was a novelist who wrote under the pen name Van Morris Goodall. Jane also had a younger sister named Judy. When Jane was just 1 year old, her parents gave her a stuffed toy chimpanzee named Jubilee. It was a life-sized replica of a baby chimp born at the London Zoo. Many of her parents' friends were horrified, saying the toy would give the little girl nightmares. But Jane's mother defended the gift, and young Jane immediately fell in love with Jubilee. That stuffed chimpanzee became Jane's constant companion. She carried it everywhere, slept with it every night, and talked to it endlessly. Her mother later said, "From the moment she got Jubilee, Jane was fascinated by animals. She would spend hours watching them, trying to understand them." Even as a toddler, Jane showed an intense curiosity about the natural world. When she was just 4 years old, she disappeared for several hours. Her family frantically searched for her, fearing the worst. Where did they finally find her? Hiding in a hen house, watching patiently to see how a hen laid an egg. When she finally emerged, covered in straw and chicken droppings, her mother didn't scold her. Instead, she sat down and listened as young Jane excitedly explained everything she had observed. This moment was crucial. It taught Jane that her curiosity was valuable, that observation was important, and that questions deserved answers. Years later, Jane would say, "My mother's support was critical. She encouraged my curiosity instead of crushing it. She taught me to observe carefully and ask questions. Those lessons shaped everything I became." Growing up with limited options. Jane grew up during World War II, a difficult time for everyone in England. Food was rationed, cities were bombed, and fear was constant. But even during these dark times, Jane found solace in nature and animals. The family moved to Bournemouth, a coastal town in southern England, where Jane spent countless hours exploring the garden, the nearby woods, and the beach. She rescued injured animals, kept detailed notes about bird behavior, and read every book about animals she could find. Her favorite books were the Tarzan novels and The Story of Dr. Dolittle. She dreamed of living in Africa among the wild animals, just like Tarzan. But there was one problem with the Tarzan stories. Jane was frustrated that Tarzan married the wrong Jane. She told her mother, "I would have been a much better companion for Tarzan than that other Jane. She was always screaming and getting into trouble." Her mother laughed and said, "Well then, you'll just have to go to Africa yourself and have your own adventures." This simple statement planted a seed in young Jane's mind. Maybe I can go to Africa. Maybe I can live among animals. Maybe my dream isn't impossible. But the path wasn't clear. Jane's family couldn't afford to send her to university. In 1950s England, women from working-class families had limited options: secretary, nurse, teacher, or housewife. A career as a scientist, especially one studying wild animals in Africa, simply wasn't a realistic possibility for a girl like Jane. After finishing school at age 18, Jane attended secretarial school in London. She learned typing, shorthand, and business correspondence. It wasn't what she dreamed of, but it was practical. She took various secretarial jobs, all while never giving up on her dream of Africa. Her friends told her to be realistic. Her teachers suggested she settle for a comfortable office job. Even some family members worried about her unrealistic fantasies. But Jane held on to her dream with quiet determination. She saved every penny she could, working multiple jobs. She took a position as a secretary at a documentary film studio, then at Oxford University. All the while, she was waiting for an opportunity, waiting for her chance. The letter that changed everything. In 1957, when Jane was 23 years old, she received a letter that would alter the course of her life. A school friend had moved to Kenya and invited Jane to visit. It was the opportunity Jane had been waiting for, a chance to finally go to Africa. But there was a problem. She didn't have enough money for the trip. Most people would have given up, but not Jane. She made a difficult decision. She quit her job in London and moved back home with her parents. She worked as a waitress, saving every shilling she earned. Her mother supported the plan completely. "If you want something badly enough," she told Jane, "you'll find a way to make it happen." After months of saving, Jane finally had enough money for a boat ticket to Kenya. In March 1957, at the age of 23, Jane Goodall boarded a ship called the Kenya Castle and sailed to Africa, the continent she had dreamed about since childhood. When she arrived in Nairobi, Kenya, Jane was overwhelmed by everything: the heat, the sounds, the smells, the incredible diversity of wildlife. This was the Africa of her dreams, and she was finally here. Her friend suggested she meet Dr. Louis Leakey, a famous paleoanthropologist who was curator of the Corendon Museum in Nairobi. Jane was nervous. She had no scientific training, no university degree, nothing that would impress a renowned scientist. But she called his office anyway. When she met Dr. Leakey, something unexpected happened. Instead of dismissing her because of her lack of credentials, he was impressed with her passion and knowledge of African wildlife. He asked her question after question about animals, and Jane answered with the enthusiasm and detailed observations of someone who had spent a lifetime watching and learning. Dr. Leakey hired her on the spot, not as a scientist, but as his secretary. It wasn't the glamorous position Jane had dreamed of, but it was a start. She was in Africa, working for a famous scientist, and she was learning. The opportunity of a lifetime. Jane worked hard as Dr. Leakey's secretary, but she also seized every opportunity to learn. She accompanied him on fossil hunting expeditions. She asked questions constantly. She observed everything. Dr. Leakey began to see something special in Jane. He noticed that she had extraordinary patience, keen observational skills, and most importantly, an unbiased mind. She hadn't been trained in formal scientific methods, which Dr. Leakey saw as an advantage. She wouldn't be constrained by scientific prejudices about how animals should behave. Dr. Leakey had been studying human evolution for years. He believed that to understand early humans, we needed to study our closest living relatives, chimpanzees. He had been searching for the right person to conduct a long-term study of wild chimpanzees, and he believed he had found that person in Jane. One day in 1960, Dr. Leakey told Jane about his plan. There was a group of wild chimpanzees living on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in Tanzania, then called Tanganyika. He wanted someone to go there and study them, to observe their behavior in their natural habitat, something that had never been properly done before. He said to Jane, "I believe you're the right person for this job." Jane was stunned. Here was the opportunity she had dreamed of, a chance to work with wild animals in the African forest. But there were significant challenges. First, she had no scientific training. Second, the British authorities wouldn't allow a young woman to live alone in the remote African wilderness. It was considered too dangerous. The first problem, Dr. Leakey said, was actually a benefit. The second problem was solved by Jane's remarkable mother. When authorities insisted that Jane needed a companion, Van Goodall, then in her late 50s, volunteered to accompany her daughter into the African forest. Can you imagine? A woman in her late 50s leaving her comfortable life in England to live in a tent in the African wilderness just to support her daughter's dream. This tells you everything you need to know about where Jane got her courage and determination. On July 14, 1960, Jane Goodall and her mother arrived at Gombe Stream Game Reserve on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in Tanzania. Jane was 26 years old, had no scientific degree, and was about to undertake a study that would revolutionize our understanding of animal behavior and human evolution. The long wait in the forest. The early days at Gombe were incredibly difficult. Jane and her mother lived in a second-hand army tent. They had basic supplies, limited food, and no guarantees that Jane would even be able to find the chimpanzees, let alone study them. Jane would wake up before dawn and trek into the steep, densely forested hills, searching for chimpanzees. The terrain was brutal: steep slopes, thick vegetation, insects everywhere. She would often hike for hours in the sweltering heat, only to catch a brief glimpse of a chimp disappearing into the forest. The chimpanzees were terrified of humans. Whenever Jane approached, they would flee. She could hear them, sometimes see them from a distance, but she couldn't get close enough to observe their behavior properly. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Jane would return to camp exhausted, discouraged, with notebook pages that were mostly blank. Some days she wondered if the project would fail before it even began. Dr. Leakey had warned her that this might happen. He had told her, "I'm giving you this opportunity because you have patience. The chimpanzees will accept you eventually, but it will take time, perhaps a very long time."
So Jane persisted. Every single day she climbed into those hills. She developed a routine. She would find a spot with a good view, sit completely still, and wait. She called this spot the peak. Hour after hour she would sit there, watching, waiting, hoping the chimpanzees would accept her presence. Her mother, dealing with her own challenges in camp, was amazed by Jane's dedication. Van later wrote, "Jane never complained. She never considered giving up. Day after day she went into that forest with the same hope and determination." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. The chimpanzees started fleeing less quickly when they saw her. Then they began watching her from the trees, curious about this strange creature who sat so patiently and never threatened them. Jane learned to move like the chimps, slowly, deliberately, non-threateningly. She learned to recognize individual chimpanzees by their faces, their walks, their personalities. She gave them names instead of numbers, something that would later be criticized by the scientific establishment, but which helped her see them as individuals. There was David Greybeard, who had distinctive white facial hair. There was Flo, a wonderful mother with a large, bulbous nose. There was Goliath, a strong male, and many others. After about 4 months of patient observation, Jane made a breakthrough. One day, she saw David Greybeard about 60 feet away from her. Instead of fleeing, he glanced at her and continued eating. He was accepting her presence. Jane could barely contain her excitement, but she sat completely still, watching. This was the moment she had been working toward. The chimpanzees were finally beginning to trust her. The observations that shook science. In October 1960, Jane witnessed something that would change science forever. She was observing David Graybeard from a distance when she saw him and another chimp doing something remarkable. They were using tools. The chimpanzees were taking long grass stems, carefully stripping off the leaves and inserting them into termite mounds. When they pulled the stems out, they were covered with termites, which the chimps ate like a snack on a stick. Jane was stunned. She knew immediately that this was important. At that time, scientists believed that tool use was what separated humans from animals. The definition of humans was man the tool maker. If chimpanzees could make and use tools, then either we needed to redefine what made humans unique or accept that the line between humans and animals was not as clear as we thought. Jane quickly sent a telegram to Dr. Leakey with her observation. His reply became famous. Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as human. But Jane didn't stop there. Over the following months and years, she made observation after observation that challenged scientific assumptions. She discovered that chimpanzees eat meat. Scientists had believed they were purely vegetarian. Jane observed them hunting colobus monkeys, sharing the meat, and even using strategic cooperation in their hunts. She documented complex social relationships. She saw chimpanzees forming alliances, holding grudges, showing affection, comforting each other, and engaging in what looked remarkably like political maneuvering. She witnessed both compassion and violence. She saw chimpanzees caring tenderly for their young, adopting orphaned chimps, and helping injured community members. But she also witnessed brutal fights, infanticide, and even a war between different chimpanzee communities that lasted 4 years. She observed individual personalities. Each chimp was unique. Some were brave, some cautious, some playful, some aggressive. They had distinct personalities just like humans. These observations revolutionized primatology and our understanding of animal behavior, but they also sparked controversy. Fighting the scientific establishment. When Jane began publishing her findings, the scientific establishment was skeptical and often hostile. She faced criticism on multiple fronts. First, she had no formal scientific training. Many scientists dismissed her work simply because she didn't have a PhD. Never mind that her observations were detailed, consistent, and groundbreaking. She wasn't one of them. Second, she named the chimpanzees instead of numbering them. Scientists argued this was too emotional, too subjective. They said she should refer to chimpanzee number 1, not David Graybeard. Jane argued that using names helped her see them as the individuals they were, and that this actually made her observations more accurate, not less. Third, she attributed emotions to animals. When Jane wrote that a chimpanzee seemed sad or joyful, scientists accused her of anthropomorphism, projecting human emotions onto animals. Jane argued that denying animals had emotions was just as biased as attributing emotions they didn't have. Fourth, she was a woman. Let's be honest, in the 1960s, the scientific world was dominated by men. Many male scientists simply couldn't accept that a young woman with no formal scientific training could make significant contributions to science. But Jane had powerful support. Dr. Leakey arranged for her to pursue a PhD at Cambridge University, even though she had never attended undergraduate college, an almost unheard-of exception. He believed her work was too important to be dismissed on procedural grounds. At Cambridge, Jane faced more resistance. Professors told her that her methodology was wrong, her conclusions were too emotional, her entire approach was unscientific. One professor told her directly, "You cannot say that chimpanzees have personalities, minds, or emotions. These are human qualities." Jane politely but firmly disagreed. She said, I learned about animal behavior not from scientists, but from my dog. As a child, my dog taught me that animals have feelings, personalities, and individual identities. Why should I deny what I can clearly observe just because it makes scientists uncomfortable? In 1965, Jane Goodall earned her PhD from Cambridge University in ethology, the study of animal behavior. Her dissertation was titled Behavior of the Free-Ranging Chimpanzee. She was now Dr. Jane Goodall, and her critics could no longer dismiss her as an untrained amateur. But the real validation came not from her degree, but from the weight of her observations. Over time, other researchers confirmed her findings. The scientific community gradually accepted that Jane had been right all along about tool use, about meat eating, about complex social behavior, about animal emotions and intelligence.
Today, Jane Goodall is recognized as one of the most important ethologists in history. Her patient, respectful approach to studying animals changed not just primatology, but all of wildlife research. Life at Gombe. Jane didn't just visit Gombe for a few months or years, she made it her home. The study she thought might last 3 years has now continued for over 60 years, making it the longest continuous study of animals in their natural habitat ever conducted. Life at Gombe was challenging but deeply fulfilling. Jane lived simply in basic accommodations without many of the comforts of modern life. She would wake up before dawn, often around 5:30 a.m., and head into the forest to find the chimpanzees. She learned to move through the forest like they did, quietly, respectfully, as part of the environment rather than an intruder. She would sit for hours, sometimes all day, watching and taking notes. Every interaction, every behavior, every relationship was carefully documented. The chimpanzees came to accept her so completely that they would go about their daily lives as if she wasn't there. Mothers would nurse their babies near her. Males would groom each other within touching distance. Young chimps would play around her feet. One of the most touching relationships Jane developed was with Flo, an older female chimpanzee who was a remarkable mother. Jane spent years observing Flo raise her offspring, Fifi, Feigen, Fabin, Flint, and Flame. Through watching Flo, Jane learned that good mothering existed in chimpanzees just as it did in humans. Flo was patient, playful, protective, and attentive. Her children thrived. When Flo died in 1972, Jane was devastated. She wrote an obituary for Flo that was published in the Sunday Times of London, the first time a major newspaper had ever published an obituary for an animal. It showed how Jane's work was changing the way people thought about animals. But life at Gombe wasn't all peaceful observation. In 1974, Jane witnessed something that shook her to her core: chimpanzees engaging in warfare. A community she had been studying split into 2 groups. Over the next 4 years, the larger group systematically hunted down and killed members of the smaller group. It was brutal, violent, and disturbingly similar to human warfare. Jane was heartbroken. She had hoped that studying chimpanzees would show that violence and war were uniquely human problems. Instead, she discovered that our capacity for organized violence might be shared with our closest relatives. She later wrote, "I had come to understand that chimpanzees, like humans, are capable of both extraordinary compassion and extreme brutality. They are truly our evolutionary cousins, sharing both our best and worst tendencies." Love and family. In 1964, Jane married Baron Hugo van Lauwijk, a Dutch wildlife photographer who had come to Gombe to document Jane's work. They shared a deep love for wildlife and adventure. Their wedding was a simple ceremony, and they spent their honeymoon observing chimpanzees, exactly what Jane wanted. In 1967, Jane and Hugo had a son, whom they named Hugo Eric Louis van Lauwijk, nicknamed Grub. Raising a child in the African wilderness presented unique challenges, but Jane was determined to continue her work while being a mother. Grub grew up at Gombe surrounded by chimpanzees and other wildlife. For safety reasons, chimpanzees can be dangerous to human children. He was kept in a protective cage when very young and always closely supervised, but he developed a deep appreciation for nature and wildlife. Years later, Grub recalled, "My childhood was extraordinary. Not many kids can say they grew up with chimpanzees as neighbors. My mother taught me to respect all living things." Sadly, Jane's marriage to Hugo ended in divorce in 1974. The strains of living in remote locations, the demands of Jane's research, and growing differences in their goals took a toll on their relationship. In 1975, Jane married Derek Bryceson, a former member of Tanzania's national parks and director of Tanzania's national parks. Derek was passionate about conservation and supported Jane's work completely. Their marriage was deeply happy, but tragically short. Derek died of cancer in 1980. Jane has said that losing Derek was one of the hardest experiences of her life. But she channeled her grief into her work, becoming even more determined to protect the chimpanzees and their habitat. From researcher to activist. By the 1980s, Jane had spent more than 2 decades at Gombe, and her research had fundamentally changed science. But she was becoming increasingly concerned about what was happening beyond Gombe's borders. Chimpanzee populations across Africa were declining rapidly. Their forest homes were being destroyed for agriculture and development. Chimps were being captured for the illegal pet trade and for use in medical research. The species that Jane loved was in serious danger. In 1986, Jane attended a conference called Understanding Chimpanzees, which brought together researchers from across Africa. What she learned at this conference changed the trajectory of her life. She heard about the horrific conditions in which chimpanzees were kept in medical research laboratories. She learned about the bushmeat trade, where chimps were hunted for food. She saw data showing that chimp populations had declined by more than 90% in some areas. Jane realized that she couldn't just be a scientist anymore. She had to become an advocate. She had to use her knowledge, her credibility, and her passion to fight for chimpanzee conservation. She said, "I went to the conference as a scientist. I left as an activist. I realized that if I spent my entire life studying chimpanzees but did nothing to save them, what was the point?" This decision required an enormous sacrifice. Jane loved her life at Gombe, the quiet days in the forest, the intimate observations, the deep connection with the chimpanzees. But she gave it up to travel the world, giving speeches, meeting with politicians, raising awareness, and fighting for conservation.
Since 1986, Jane has spent about 300 days a year traveling. She has given thousands of lectures, met with countless world leaders, and inspired millions of people. She rarely gets to return to Gombe, the place she loves most, because she's too busy fighting to save it and places like it. When asked if she regrets this sacrifice, Jane says, "Of course I miss Gombe, but the chimpanzees need more than my observations. They need action, and if I can help save them by traveling and speaking, then that's what I must do." The Jane Goodall Institute. In 1977, Jane founded the Jane Goodall Institute, JGI, a global organization dedicated to wildlife conservation, animal welfare, and environmental education. What started as a small organization focused on chimpanzees has grown into a worldwide movement. The Institute's work includes protecting chimpanzee habitat through community-centered conservation programs. JGI works with local communities in Africa, recognizing that conservation can only succeed if it benefits the people who live near wildlife. Rescuing and rehabilitating chimpanzees who have been orphaned by the bushmeat trade or rescued from captivity. JGI operates sanctuaries in Africa where these chimps can live in peace. Fighting illegal wildlife trafficking and working to end the use of chimpanzees in entertainment and medical research.
environmental education programs that teach young people about conservation and inspire them to take action, community empowerment projects that improve healthcare, education, and livelihoods in areas surrounding chimpanzee habitat, based on the understanding that you can't save wildlife if local people are struggling to survive. One of JGI's most successful programs is called Takare, Take Care. It's a community-led conservation approach that provides communities with resources for healthcare, education, and sustainable livelihoods in exchange for their participation in protecting the forest and wildlife. The results have been remarkable. In areas where Takare operates, deforestation has slowed or even reversed, chimp populations have stabilized, and local communities have higher standards of living. It's proof that conservation and human development can work together. Jane often says, "We cannot protect the environment if people are struggling to survive. We need an approach that lifts up both people and nature." Roots and Shoots, empowering young people. In 1991, Jane started a program that might be her most important legacy, Roots and Shoots. It began when a group of Tanzanian students came to Jane with concerns about environmental problems in their community. Jane listened and helped them develop action plans. From that small beginning, Roots and Shoots has grown into a global movement. Today, it operates in over 60 countries, with thousands of groups, from preschools to universities. The program empowers young people to identify problems in their communities, environmental, animal welfare, or humanitarian, and take action to solve them. The name Roots and Shoots comes from Jane's observation that the roots and shoots of plants seem small and fragile, but together they can break through the hardest ground. Young people, she believes, are like those roots and shoots. Individually they seem small, but together they can change the world. Roots and Shoots groups have done remarkable things. Students in Uganda built fuel-efficient stoves that reduce deforestation. A group in China created a sanctuary for rescued dogs. Students in New York cleaned up polluted rivers. Kids in India started recycling programs in their schools. Groups around the world have planted millions of trees. Jane visits Roots and Shoots groups whenever she can. She listens to young people's ideas, encourages their projects, and celebrates their successes. She has said, "Young people, when informed and empowered, can change the world. They give me hope." Jane's daily life, still making a difference. Even in her late 80s, Jane Goodall maintains an exhausting schedule. A typical year for Jane involves traveling to dozens of countries, giving hundreds of speeches, attending meetings with conservation organizations, and visiting Roots and Shoots groups. Her day typically starts early, around 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. She begins with emails, responding to messages around the world, coordinating with her team, staying connected to ongoing projects. If she's traveling, which she usually is, she might have several flights in one day, moving from one speaking engagement to another. She gives lectures to packed auditoriums, meets with government officials, talks to journalists, and somehow finds time to sign books and take photos with fans who want to thank her. Despite her fame, Jane remains remarkably humble and accessible. She treats everyone, from presidents to schoolchildren, with the same respect and kindness. People who meet her often comment on how present she is, how she really listens when you speak to her. Jane travels with a small stuffed chimpanzee named Mr. H, a gift from a friend who was blind. Mr. H has accompanied Jane to more than 60 countries. She says, "Mr. H reminds me why I do this work. He represents all the chimps who don't have a voice." When she's not traveling, Jane lives simply in Bournemouth, England, the same town where she grew up. Her home is filled with books, photographs from Gombe, and letters from people around the world whose lives she's touched. She maintains a vegetarian diet, practices yoga, and spends time in nature whenever possible. She loves spending time with her family, including her son Grub, now known as Hugo, his wife, and her grandchildren. But even at home, she's working, writing books, recording podcasts, doing virtual meetings with Roots and Shoots groups, and planning her next trips. People often ask Jane, "When will you retire? When will you rest?" She smiles and says, "I'll rest when the work is done, but the work is never done, so I keep going." The wisdom of a lifetime. Over her decades of work, Jane Goodall has shared profound insights that inspire millions. Here are some of her most powerful messages. On taking action. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. On hope. The greatest danger to our future is apathy. We cannot save the world if we don't care. On starting small. You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. On persistence. Change happens by listening and then starting a dialogue with the people who are doing something you don't believe is right. On animals. The least I can do is speak out for those who cannot speak for themselves. On her mission. Every individual matters. Every individual has a role to play. Every individual makes a difference. On intelligence and heart. Only if we understand can we care. Only if we care will we help. Only if we help shall all be saved. On finding your path. My mission is to create a world where we can live in harmony with nature. On young people. The most important thing is to actually think about what you do, to become aware of the consequences of your actions, and to think through what you can do to make a difference. 4 reasons for hope. Despite all the environmental destruction she's witnessed, Jane Goodall remains remarkably optimistic. She often speaks about her 4 reasons for hope. First, the amazing human brain. Humans created many of our current problems, but our intelligence, creativity, and problem-solving abilities can also solve them. Every day, people are inventing new technologies, finding innovative solutions, and discovering better ways to live sustainably. Second, the resilience of nature. Jane has witnessed places that were devastated, forests destroyed, rivers polluted, species driven away, come back to life when given a chance. Nature wants to recover, we just need to give it the opportunity. Third, the power of young people. When young people are informed about problems and empowered to take action, they can create amazing change. They bring energy, creativity, and determination that can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable to older generations. Fourth, the indomitable human spirit. Jane says, yes, we face huge challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, poverty, inequality, but we also have the tools to solve these problems. The question is, do we have the will? I believe we do. The challenges she's seen. Jane's life hasn't been without heartbreak. She's witnessed things that would break many people's spirits. She's seen forests she loved destroyed, converted to farmland, or burned for charcoal. She's seen chimpanzee populations decline by more than 90% since she started her work. At the start of her research, there were about 1 to 2 million chimpanzees in Africa. Today, there are fewer than 300,000. She's visited medical research laboratories where chimpanzees were kept in tiny cages, alone, with nothing to do, often for decades. She's seen chimps in zoos living in concrete enclosures with no enrichment, no companionship, no chance to express their natural behaviors. She's learned about orphaned baby chimps whose mothers were killed by poachers. These babies, traumatized and alone, cling to their dead mothers until they're captured and sold into the illegal pet trade or used as props for tourist photos. One of the darkest periods of Jane's life came in 1975, when 4 of her research students were kidnapped from Gombe by rebel forces from Congo. The ordeal lasted months and ended with the students' release, but it traumatized everyone involved and changed the way research could be conducted at Gombe. Jane felt responsible for putting them in danger. There have been times when Jane has felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems. She has said, "There are days when I feel depressed, when I wonder if anything I do really makes a difference. But then I remember, giving up is not an option. If I give up, who will speak for the chimpanzees?" Recognition and legacy. Jane Goodall's contributions have been recognized worldwide. She's received countless honors and awards. She was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, DBE, by Queen Elizabeth II in 2004, giving her the title Dame. She's awarded over 100 international awards, including the French Legion of Honor. She's received honorary doctorates from more than 45 universities. She was named a United Nations Messenger of Peace. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. But Jane doesn't do this work for recognition. When accepting awards, she often donates the prize money to conservation efforts and uses her acceptance speech to advocate for chimpanzees and the environment. She once said, "I don't want to be remembered for the awards I've received. I want to be remembered for what I've accomplished, for the chimpanzees I've helped save, for the young people I've inspired, for the positive change I've created." What we can learn from Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall's extraordinary life teaches us powerful and timeless lessons. 1. Your dreams are not impossible. Jane began with no money, no university degree, and no influential connections, only a deep fascination with animals and an unwavering determination. She proved that passion, persistence, and curiosity can overcome barriers that seem insurmountable. 2. Curiosity is a strength, not a weakness. Jane never stopped asking questions, observing with patience, and seeking to understand rather than judge. Her ability to look closely, listen deeply, and learn continuously led to discoveries that transformed science. 3. Kindness and empathy can reshape the world. Her gentle approach to studying chimpanzees showed the world that compassion is not a limitation, it is a superpower. Through empathy, she built trust, formed groundbreaking insights, and inspired a global movement for conservation. 4. Every individual can make a difference. Jane often reminds us that the choices we make, what we buy, how we live, how we treat each other, create ripples. You don't need fame, wealth, or title to change the world. You just need commitment and the courage to begin. 5. Protecting the planet starts with hope. Despite witnessing destruction and loss, Jane never allowed herself to fall into despair. She believes hope is a responsibility, a force that motivates action. Her lifelong dedication to wildlife and the environment reminds us that it's never too late to protect what we love.